I'm Karen Block. I'm the Deputy Director of the Social Equity Institute and also one of the theme leaders for the Migration and Mobility Research team, along with my colleague Karen Farquharson, who's also here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of lands that we're meeting on today, as the Wurundjeri Woi nations, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I think it's always good to remember at events such as this one that apart from those who are Indigenous, we all have a migration story in our history and in our families. And so even though you would think from some current policies that would not be the case. So we've got a great lineup of people. I just wanted to say a little bit about how this event came about. We hold a regular migration conference for early career researchers and PhD students here at the university. And last year we had so many fantastic abstracts that we couldn't fit in all the really good ones. And there was a particularly good cluster of abstracts focused on gender and migration. And so we thought, well, let's pull them out and have a separate symposium so that we could say yes to more other people. And that's how this event came about today. And I was really delighted that everybody who we invited to come along said yes, and they're here today. So we have 5 early career researchers speaking. Everyone will get 15 minutes each and 5 minutes of question times at the end. I have my timekeeping with that, and we will be keeping strictly to time. We also have our research team leaders from the Institute in gender equity theme, and that's Kylie and Victor over here. And they're going to be speaking at the end, responding to the papers that they've heard. So as you'll probably know, the Institute is all about multidisciplinary research, interdisciplinarity. So we've got our speakers are from multiple disciplines, our discussants are from different disciplines, and we hope that that'll be a really fruitful and useful discussion for everyone. So we'll have our first 3 speakers, and then we'll have a break for 20 minutes. We have some refreshments over there, and there's probably proper coffee downstairs somewhere as well. Housekeeping, the bathrooms are located at either end of the building in the stairwells. There is an accessible bathroom on the ground floor, all gender bathroom on the ground floor on this side as well, if anybody needs that. We are recording the session, but so the cameras will just be on the speakers, and if anyone is concerned about having their question recorded, just let us know and we can edit it out. Or if anybody says anything they're concerned about, just let us know. Don't let that hold you back. Okay, so I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Borges Jelinic, whose talk is entitled "In the Middle, Waiting for a Future: Time and Waiting, Partner Migration and Family Violence in Australia." So Anna is a Brazilian-Australian research practitioner working mainly in migration and violence against women. She graduated in psychology with honours in Brazil and holds a postgraduate qualification from Griffith University and the University of Queensland. And that's probably enough about it. You can say more about yourself if you like. But you've travelled down from Queensland for the event, yes? Yes. Yeah, which is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all here. I am not texting anyone. I am checking my notes here. So I will start acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and remind everybody that this land has never been ceded, and this is extremely important in the history of Australia, but also very important in the history of migrant Australia. I am a research practitioner. That means I am a psychologist. I work mainly with migrant women on uncertain visa status that experience domestic and family violence, and I'm also a research fellow with the Disruptive Violence Department at Griffith University. I will try to focus on data from my research, but sometimes I make comments that come from my clinic, and if that's not clear to you, happy to answer. I will try to keep that to a minimum, but it does happen. So I'm going to start telling you a little bit about the history of migration of women to Australia. The other thing is these slides have a lot of information. We're doing this a bit different today. I'm going to tell you less than what is in these slides, so you have a chance to take a picture of it or read if you need for context, because I'll be jumping to a few points that connect in the end. So we have in Australia a history, and in other countries as well, a history of preferring male migrants or families than individual single women. There has been a history in Australia of stopping women from migrating. And what we can see that happens through history is that men are the largest migrants, and I'm going to keep talking in binaries, men and women, acknowledging the limitations of that. But men will score as the highest migrants in all categories, but dependent visas, particularly partner visas, and we can see the difference is quite large in that category. As that's relevant, Australia is a migrant-seeking country. It grows through migration. It grows based on the fact that migrants have more children than non-migrants. And in Australia, there was a movement of a lot of migration and then restricting migration through the years. And that meant that it became harder and harder to migrate to Australia, and women migrating as dependent became more and more common. One of the reasons why that happens is because part of migration is a right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention of Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Family migration scholars have identified tensions between state and individual interests, as the state controls all visas, including family reunification, but it remains an individual's citizen's right to choose their partner. So we see a lot of tension on the fact that that may be out of government control sometimes. However, there is a lot of control on visas anyway, and one of the things that we saw through the years was the institution of the two-stage visa for partner visas, meaning partner visas had to be granted temporary, and then you would have to send more documents to get it permanent, and it had to be in a relation for 2 years. So in terms of legislating waiting, partner visas may be at the forefront, right? What we see is that in more recent years, other visas start to have more and more waiting times to be granted. So this also had a bit of an impact, legislated or unlegislated, on how we see migration. So much so that in late 2022, Australian federal government decided to have a look at it. In 2023, they released a report. So, and in this report, they acknowledge the issue of time, and they say it's not Australia's national interest to maintain a large proportion of temporary entrants with no pathway to citizenship, as it undermines our democratic resilience and social cohesion. And in the report, the government commits to review the drivers that have created a continuing permanent temporary cohort with a view to ensuring future cohorts do not emerge. So why am I talking about waiting? If waiting has been addressed in Australia, I think my argument is clear. It has not. And waiting causes a lot of harm, and that's why it's important to keep an eye on waiting. Home Affairs has committed to address waiting times and is starting with the visas listed there. And I will be honest, my clients are having a faster process this year than they had for the last whatever years I've been doing it, 12 or so years. So there seems to be something going on, even if I cannot, I do not have the numbers to give to you right now. In my PhD, so this data comes from my PhD, I studied what I called sponsored women, so a specific group of migrant women that were on the pathway to partner visas and separated due to domestic and family violence before they were granted permanent residency. So this was the group that I saw. When this happens, there is a provision in the law, there is a family violence provisions, and the migrant can continue the visa away from the former partner. But there are a lot of conditions for that. And some of those conditions are, you first need to prove this was a genuine relationship, whatever that means, we can talk about it later. And then you need to prove relevant domestic violence, not to be confused with domestic violence, relevant domestic violence. If you do that, and they do not accept your evidence, you may be sent to an independent expert for evaluation. You may be refused a visa and need to appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal that may grant you, may accept your case and send you back to immigration. So immigration can do the right thing or may expect something else to be done, and things can escalate all the way to the Minister of Migration, that usually will just intervene if they find the case to be unique, not to be confused with people suffering, or just if the case is unique. So these are some of the experiences that we observe when we are engaging with this pathway, the family violence provisions pathway. And that's where I usually work with a lot of clients as a psychologist, not as a lawyer. So if we add all the possible stages between claiming family violence and being granted permanent residency, you can see you can easily get over a 2-year waiting period. And I will show you how long the women that I interview have waited. And the problem is the family violence provisions exist to make migrants, to make it possible for migrants to separate without a penalty. And if the migrants start to think through time, they may believe it's worthwhile staying in an abusive relationship, wait for a visa, and then separate. So it's quite dangerous to have such waiting times there. Other countries have faced it. I went through just Anglophone countries here, but we can talk about other countries as well, have gone through thinking through it. And a lot of countries reached the same conclusion. We need to reduce re-traumatization, and we need to prioritize this kind of situation, this sponsored women situation. And countries like New Zealand have specific fast-tracked systems to this specific visa issue. And countries like Canada just abolished the two-stage visa and the 2-year waiting period. So it goes straight to permanent residency. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm just saying this is an international issue. In 2012, Australia tried and failed to have a national definition of what is domestic and family violence. And on back of that, there were a lot of changes that we were expecting would come through that didn't come. Having said that, there is a specific family violence unit inside the department that women seeing these visas. And just about time again, the immigration doesn't publish those specific times for, nor does the tribunal for sponsored women. But talking about partner visas in general, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal process in 2019 was 603 days, and in 2022 it was already 1,578 days. When we get to academia, what we see is that waiting has been described as not an unexpected result of the immigration system, but actually a technique to create temporary migrants. So it is a manipulation of time that is deliberate. Migrants do not necessarily stay stuck. It's just this ongoing send papers, wait, request more papers, wait a little more, justify something, and you stay in this chasing in the wheel that doesn't necessarily take you anywhere. What we also see is that waiting harms people. Waiting can be quite harmful, but waiting can harm people differently, depending on the intersecting vulnerabilities of those who wait. More socially vulnerable people are more impacted people will be by waiting. And we see people talking about that, during waiting, I did all these other things. In my student visa, I had the chance to do all these other things, but there's still an impact of plans being delayed, things not going, as they would be if people had privilege stay where they are. Research on the impact of waiting on partner visa applicants, including sponsored women, exist, but they are limited comparing to the research with other countries. The other thing is, we know that these women are also experiencing domestic family violence. So we're talking about people that already went through trauma and are waiting. I interviewed 20 women in a longitudinal study, so I interviewed them twice, 1 year period, to talk about their experiences with the visa and with domestic and family violence. And here you see they're all pseudonyms. You will see the the time they had been in Australia when I interviewed them for the first time, so we can add one more year after that, and when they had separated, how long they had been separated when I interviewed them. And at this stage, none of them had permanent residency. Some of them had permanent residency by the second interview. And these are way too many numbers, but this is just one of the things we did was a check on their mental health. And you will see first of all, you see that some women in 1 year didn't move. It's migration, they're still with migration, their case is still with migration, their case is still with AAT, 1 year later still with AAT as expected. But also you see that women that have been refused their visa or women that had moved towards appeal will have higher numbers, meaning their mental health they were doing worse with their mental health by that stage. So these cases to illustrate a little bit when I went through the data, what I saw. And what I saw was concerns about mental health, and I'm going to put that aside for now. And then there were other two concerns. Women talking about their willingness to be investigated and concern for waiting times, and at the same time, what they did with the time, right? So how productive was the use of the time while waiting? So one of them in the interview was Sierra, again, pseudonym. She was in her 40s, and she's a woman that recognized Australia's need to protect their borders from criminals, as she put it. She perceived the treatment she received, however, due to her visa status as discrimination. And you see a little bit her acknowledgement that, yeah, I understand they need to control their borders, but what I have to say, to accelerate the process instead of make people suffer day by day. I don't treat people like criminals. So she was one of the participants, and this repeats throughout the 20 participants in one way or another. This idea of, okay, you can test me, but accelerate the process. When I talked to her later, she talked about the shame and the feeling of being stuck, and she did experience clinical levels of depression. Nevertheless, Sierra was a very active worker in Australia, in the security area and as a chef. She had plans to progress professionally, and that was part of her difficulty to deal with the waiting was because she wanted to move forward with her life. And then I interviewed her again. She had been granted her visa. And she's the one that tells me, where is it? My life basically started 15 June, nothing certain in your life. You cannot plan nothing, you're not in hell or in paradise, just stay in the middle, waiting for a future that maybe you feel discriminated because you are not here. So many questions asked. So she felt that she had to justify her presence and that she had to be a deserving migrant instead of feeling that she was being protected from domestic and family violence. And again, many women said that. So if we move towards reflections on hearing similar stories over and over again, those women are right. Most of these visas are granted in the end of the day. Waiting makes sense. But at the same time, they know that Australia is a migrant-seeking country. There are 179 visas you can apply for. It makes sense to try to find a way. But also because of that, it's very clear that the situation for sponsored women become less about mobility between borders and more about social mobility. In the end of the day, we're not controlling if people can cross borders. We're controlling if people can access welfare in some kinds of benefits. I will just say one more sentence on that. So in the end, what we're saying is how people should be good citizens and not the needs of protection. The trajectory of sponsored women is hardly about migration. It's about starting a family. They come here for a family, and they finding themselves building a life alone in a new country is a consequence of the experience of DV in that relationship. Therefore, women are really looking for protection, and we should approach that way and not an economic look to migration. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. We've got 5 minutes for questions if you want to
Yes,
stay
okay.
So any questions?
Yeah, it's not a question, but I would like to, when I was listening to your presentation, I related to my research, like some of my participants, their visa application was being delayed by their in-laws. Like they were at front, they were saying to their son on call, why aren't you applying? Why it's taking so long? And secretly they were asking them not to call her, save money and send that to us, because when she will go there, your expenses would enhance and all that. So that was something like, immigration department also takes this time, but in our culture, or when it's more in the involvement of extended family system, they can also play a part in delaying that process or encouraging not to call them. So they stay tangled between the waiting periods. And sometimes they feel like their application is on the way, but it's not lodged at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. I interviewed women that their abusive partner was not presented the second lot of documents. So the delay was part of the abuse, right? Threats of deportation, the delays being part of the abuse. The thing is, the government also adds to that waiting time.
Yeah.
So in the end, waiting while you're in the relationship, the sponsor does hold a lot of power in how things progress. And after you separate, there is nothing that says this case would be looked more, in a different way than it would go in any way. One of the most surprising things from my PhD was I wanted to talk about domestic violence and mental health, right? That was my interest. And in the end, there was a lot of evidence about the difficulty to prove genuine relationship. So all those barriers for women migrating would come up in that space. Like, is this really a genuine relationship? And then, the cultural relationships were frowned upon, and people with, big age differences, and people that left kids back in their home country and whatnot. I had a client that got refused on the ground. I did not have a client. I had a participant that got refused on the grounds of genuine relationship. From the 20 women I interviewed, 11 were refused on the grounds of genuine relationship. And one of them got refused because the perpetrator told immigration she was a lesbian. He was a man, she was a woman. He said she was a lesbian. And she said, well, I'm actually bisexual, immigration escort. And they refused because they said it was not a genuine relationship because she was bisexual. So they don't have to much rhyme or reason. So yeah, I think that sponsors hold a lot of power to hold that process back. And there is no immigration incentive to, hold back on that.
When I was refused for a visa for New Zealand because of their requirements, they were not accepting my relationship with my husband as genuine. So we kept on sending pictures, our birth certificates, but they were not convinced, right?
Yes. I'm really sorry to hear, but I do hear you. I travel alone a lot, and I happen to be married, and people ask me, where's my husband, a lot. So there is an idea of what couples do or shouldn't do that really is pervasive in society, really gets in here.
But this capacity of settlement resistance and lack of capacity to do what settlement and getting public resources to stop.
None of it exists. So no, because none of it exists. There is no settlement service for partner visas. People separating to partner visas. So sure, certainly people can go to a community legal service that deals with migration law that may need to delay in a month or so to get the evidence together, especially if people speak English or not, write English or not, all those things. But there is, no. So just before this report came out in 2023, and that's a problem, right? I can't prove that to you because the website got updated. But probably going to the Wayback Machine, you can see immigration was very clear, we do not commit to timelines. And we do not commit to timelines means we do not commit to timelines. If we are married for exactly 2 years and we separate before I get granted my permanent residency, I still have to go to this, right? So there is no, time is really manipulated in many ways in this process.
Thank you. I think we'll have to move on. So thanks so much to Anna. That was Sam O'Donnell's talk is entitled Punishable Victims, Broadening Understandings of Punitiveness to Capture Women's Experiences of Family Violence and Precarity. Samantha's a PhD candidate in criminology at the University of Melbourne. She's also a lecturer in criminal law and procedure at Melbourne Law School. And her PhD research explores precarity, family violence, and immigration law and policy in Australia. And say more about this, if you'd like to.
Thanks so much, Karen. I'm no longer a lecturer, but I am still working. I'm also a lawyer, and I slightly changed the title as well, which is why it's slightly different. I didn't tell you the new version of the title, so that's my fault, parents. So thanks very much, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, so the Wurundjeri people, and pay respect to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the room today, as well as the ongoing violence in this land, but also ongoing violence in other places like Palestine as well. So it's so wonderful to be part of this amazing conversation on gender and migration. So this is my new title, so Punishable Victims, Interrogating Intersections between Gender-Based Violence and Punitive Migration Policies in Australia. So just as a brief overview, I'll start by exploring migration policy and gender-based violence. I'll then focus on 3 key findings in relation to punishable victims, and then I'll end with 3 key takeaways. So on March 2021, then Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Home Affairs, Alex Hawke, issued a statement accompanying a particular ministerial direction, Direction 90. And this statement included the following quote: "Family violence and crimes against vulnerable members of the community have no place in Australia and will not be tolerated. These changes align with the Australian community's expectation that non-citizens who commit serious offences will not be permitted to enter or stay in Australia." So Direction 90 really operates as this guide for decision makers when they're applying the character test. And so under the character test, decision makers can use that to either refuse or cancel a visa. And I think this quote from Minister Hawke really succinctly highlights how family violence is directly engaged to support these really exclusionary bordering practices. And so Direction 90 really establishes family violence as a primary consideration to be taken into account. And within this direction, the types of crimes that are viewed very seriously by both the Australian government and the Australian community, and that's a direct quote, include crimes of a violent nature against women or children, regardless of the sentence imposed, as well as acts of family violence, regardless of whether there was a conviction for an offence or a sentence imposed. So visa cancellations on the basis of family violence, they're really encouraged, and the traditional due process mechanisms that you normally get in criminal processes aren't there. So you can really see how family violence becomes that primary consideration in these processes. So this direction was introduced under the Liberal Party. It was replaced last year in March by Direction 99 when the Labor Party came into power. That's marginally less punitive, but the language around family violence remains exactly the same. So I use this example to really highlight how the Australian state's engagement of the rhetoric of gender-based violence is really used to fuel this fear and anxiety around migration. And so the language used affirms Australia as a country where family violence has no place, and it affirms this us and other narrative. I think this framing also really affirms racialized logics. So the work of Shireen Razak and Interpal Gruel, they really explore how depictions of gender-based violence are problematically engaged to affirm the West as modern and superior in opposition to often global South countries that are depicted as patriarchal and inferior. But I argue that what this rhetoric ignores is how these same very policies actually harmfully impact victim survivors of gender-based violence when their migration status is temporary. So today, I'll explore some data from qualitative interviews conducted as part of my broader PhD project on family violence and immigration law and policy. In this project, I spoke to 27 practitioners, and I also spoke to 12 women with lived experience. And in this paper, I consider a subset of these interviews, so 12 interviews with practitioners, as well as one interview with a woman from South Asia with lived experience of these intersections. And I'll refer to her story today using the pseudonym Melanie. And through analysis of these interviews, I really suggest that punitive migration policies have these primary and secondary harms. And I focus on 5 harms in the broader paper on which this presentation is based. So how gender-based violence is wrapped up in experiences of punishment, the positioning of criminalisation above victimisation, hidden experiences of gender-based violence, how women are deemed undeserving victims, and consequential visa cancellations. And in exploring these harms, I suggest that these policies are felt in punitive ways by victim survivors of gender-based violence. So I seek to make this new contribution in terms of the framing victim punishability. And I use this framing to really interrogate the way the Australian state co-opts the discourse of gender-based violence in support of these exclusionary policies. I won't have time to focus on all 5 harms, but I will just focus on 3 today. So turning to the first harm, across the analysed interviews, a theme that developed was the chilling effect of detention and deportation on family violence reports. So that meant that women's experiences of gender-based violence really became hidden. I think this is really clearly shown in Melanie's story. So just as an introduction to her story, Melanie travelled to Australia by boat alongside her husband from their country in South Asia. And when she arrived, she ended up in immigration detention, which she told me looked and felt like a prison. And when she was in detention, she started this process of applying for a protection visa. Once she left immigration detention, her application was rejected. And when we spoke, she was still in an ongoing appeal process. And when I asked Melanie about her experience of detention, she explained the following. In the detention centre, they interviewed me. That time, I didn't tell anything. Why I didn't tell? Because I'm very scared. That time, I'm also in the detention centre. Very scary. Also, the people told me, don't tell your problem after they put in the jail. So the brutal conditions in immigration detention, I think, are really evident here, where fears and rumours really pervade, which means it's not this space where it's conducive to sharing experiences of family violence. And because Melanie didn't share her experiences initially, that was one reason that might have influenced why her protection visa was rejected. And so she was at risk of being sent back to her country of origin. She was right in that final stage of the process. Many practitioners also describe this chilling effect on reporting that can happen in the broader community as well. So a domestic violence specialist told me how women stopped reporting their experiences of family violence after a perpetrator in a tight-knit community was detained after a family violence incident when police became involved. The practitioner explained, everyone found out about it and everyone else stopped reporting. So we were getting a lot of reports around domestic and family violence, a lot of disclosures. But after he was detained, that man, I had women retract their stories to me that hadn't gone to the police. The system hadn't responded. And yet they retracted because they were so scared that their husbands would be detained. So I think this story really highlights how women are forced to choose between reporting family violence and their partner potentially being detained, or not reporting, but then potentially being forced to remain in this unsafe situation. A number of practitioners also told me about the social, financial, and emotional burdens experienced by women when their partners were detained and at risk of removal or deportation after they'd formally reported their experiences. So the harm women experienced in this situation was really compounded because due to their visa status, they often couldn't access any governmental payment or support. So a migration lawyer explained that they'd worked on cases where the perpetrator's visa had been cancelled due to family violence, but the victim's father wanted to reconcile. They explained perpetrator's visa's been cancelled, being in detention centre, and victim and small children left on their own outside in the community. And often they might experience significant financial hardship because the partners in detention can't work. And then family law practitioners also suggested that there's this particularly harmful impact on women with children. So a family lawyer noted that for non-dependent visa holders, the cancellation doesn't impact them, except they lose often, the ability to claim child support or have financial support from the partner who might be removed. So here I think the state really sees women on temporary visas as not deserving of support. And I think that really invisibilises and exacerbates their experiences of harm. And then the final harm that I'll focus on today is consequential visa cancellations. So migrant and refugee women on dependent visas, so that's where their visa is connected to, like they might be a family member on a protection visa, they can also face the risk of consequential visa cancellation. So a lawyer shared the story of a woman who was a dependent on her partner's protection visa, and her visa was then consequentially cancelled under Section 140 of the Migration Act. They explained she reported family violence, and I think that led to the cancellation of his visa. But it's a really awful situation where we don't know, because they don't give her access to any information. But knowing the details of the case, I'm assuming it's because she reported to the police, and then that information became known to the department, and I assume they cancelled his visa. So there's a real lack of clarity around why her visa was cancelled. And the migration lawyer assumes it was at least in part because of the family violence she experienced. But importantly, I think this lack of clarity is because of the immigration law processes. So this finding really evidences a potential, if not actual, consequence of reporting family violence if women are a dependent on a perpetrator's visa. And there was this bill that was supposed to be, attempted to be passed by the Liberal Party that would have strengthened a lot of these kind of cancellation mechanisms. And a lot of practitioners in the space also commented on this risk in regards to this consequential visa cancellation as well. So just some key takeaways before I end. So the first key takeaway, I think, from this research is that this framework really expands the who of punishment. So Katja Franco, a border criminologist, explains that the experiences of criminalised migrants, and I quote, radically transform the who and the what of punishment. And I hopefully have shown that victim punishability further disturbs this frame by expanding the who of punishment to also include victim survivors of gender-based violence. Secondly, this paper challenges state rhetoric that positions these punitive migration policies as a legitimate response to tackling gender-based violence, when often they're not engaging in other strategies like offering women supports or access to support if they're choosing to leave a relationship. So through the framing of punishable victims, I think we can more clearly hold the Australian state accountable for the gendered and racialised harms that take place through these processes. And thirdly, I've shown how migrants' experiences of victimisation are intimately connected to other forms of violence exacted through immigration law and policy. So I think the harms depicted in this paper should be read as contributing to the abolition of immigration detention and other violent practices practices of immigration restriction in Australia. So thank you so much for listening. I'm trying to develop this into an article to be published, so any feedback is more than welcome. And yeah, can't wait to hear the rest of the papers. Thank you.
Since Sam.
It was great. Thank you very much, Sam. Two things. One is made me think of, this debate of do not hurt the victim, if sometimes you incarcerate the perpetrator, you hurt the victim, is the debate in the US since the 70s. It's the whole thing. And when we brought when we as Australia brought the laws, the tough laws on strangulation, and was a big thing in the domestic violence world of let's not go the US way, let's be very purposeful. And it seems that things went through the back door. So they brought all the same punishments in the US, not for the broad Australian population, but for the migration population. I wonder if you agree with that. We're having a bit of a mirroring. The other thing I wanted to ask you directly is how that goes, especially with protection visas. When we understand that one of the categories of protection visa is if people cannot be returned to their countries should not have protections for domestic and family violence. And at the same time, I talk about people that Australia know they experience domestic and family violence, so much so that visas are being cancelled, and them having their visa cancelled. You know what I mean? In some ways, it should straighten their claim, but it is weakening their claim. So just your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first question, I think there's definitely a lot of those similar elements, like with the coercive control legislation and criminalising coercive control. I know there were a lot of quite a few Aboriginal academics who were talking about these particular policies have particular consequences and that we should be moving away from criminalisation. So I think definitely this aspect in terms of migration law has a lot of similarities in terms of that particular context as well. In terms of the second question, this is just quite a small part of my broader PhD project. And in terms of protection visas, it's definitely really tricky. There's quite a gendered element where often they will just interview, a family might come and they will just interview the male family member. And so this, like the migration lawyer explained in regards to that woman who had her visa cancelled, she would have had a protection claim in her own right and she should have been interviewed in the first place, but she wasn't, which kind of compounded the harm that she then experienced as well. And yes, it's in terms of protection visas, you can apply on the basis of family violence. I got some freedom of information statistics and the success rate is about 13%. So it's really low, which I think mirrors some of those other aspects in terms of protection where we're focusing on highly skilled, whatever that means, and really limiting access for refugees as well. So yeah, definitely a lot of those other intersections in terms of that protection visa process more broadly. So hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. One thing so I wanted to ask you a question, and I see a lot of synergies in that. The issue of evidence and what counts and when do you give it? How the state uses that as a way to, I don't know, whether to punish or, I'm just quite curious about that. I'm sort of interested in your thinking around that. Has it, to me, when they were talking and then you are talking, it keeps coming up in, oh, this woman didn't really report, and so whatever was rejected, it sort of seemed to come up quite a bit in what is considered as good evidence, the timelines around that, and how it keeps appearing, and the state's kind of using that as a way to punish. I don't know whether it's correct for me to call it punish, but I see that a lot in also anti-racism work, where they're like, well, we can't do anything about it because we have no evidence. I don't know. I'm quite curious about your thoughts.
100%. Yeah, I've just finalized a first full draft of my thesis, which is exciting, but part of it is focusing on that evidence aspect. And it's really interesting because I looked at both the partner visa and kind of what Anna is focusing on with that genuine aspect, which is really focused when you're trying to come on a partner visa, it's proving that genuine relationship. We kind of ignore the harm. And then when you're coming on a protection visa, it's really proving, oh, there's this culture over there and it's really violent over there, but I need protection from Australia, which is just amazing. And so there's quite different rhetorics that are going on. And both require this intense level of documentary evidence. Like with protection visa process, they say, oh, you don't need documentary evidence, but then, any inconsistencies in evidence, they'll critique the person without necessarily recognising the impact of trauma. Or I had a migration lawyer explain, they want the documentary evidence, so they want you to show scars and have evidence from a hospital, but then when you take a picture of an injury, they say, oh, well, you just took that picture for this claim. So evidence is such a big thing and a very easy way to refuse, but then at the same time, often there's other ways to refuse protection visas. Like
I guess my question, sorry, to clarify, is whether you've done some theorizing around it. I would like to read it on your sleeves.
In terms of the theorizing, in terms of the evidence, I guess it's one way legally to refuse people's harm, but I think in terms of the overarching theoretical framework, I've done a lot of thinking with Anderson and the community of value and the idea of who is the victim of value and how do they prove their worthiness, and how does that kind of differentiate based on what visa you're kind of coming under. Yeah, so happy to chat more.
Another talk coming up in the break. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.
So I'd like to introduce Sana Ashraf. Her talk is entitled Silence Behind the Locked Doors, a qualitative study of domestic violence experiences of Pakistani immigrant women in Australia. And Sana is a PhD candidate at the School of Social and Political Science here at the University of Melbourne. She holds an MA in Social Research Methods from the University of Leeds in the UK and an MPhil in Sociology from the University of the Punjab, Pakistan. Very well credentialed. Thanks, Sana.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I proceed further, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I work, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and that their sovereignty was never ceded. I am Sana, and currently I am stuck between my second and third year, which is hopefully going to start by the mid of April. And my research here so far represents my work in progress, you can say, because it's still developing. And I've just ended up my field work and begin to draft my data analysis chapters. So first of all, I would like to give a slight background of the issue. Domestic violence against women is a multifaceted social problem that knows no borders. It occurs as a pervasive practice in Pakistani culture, as out of 52,370 reported cases of assault in 2021, 27,273 cases were about violence against women only. Being located on the patriarchal belt, Pakistan also embodies a rigid patriarchal culture in which male dominating norms govern the thinking processes of the individuals. Similarly, living in a patrilocal extended family system after marriage is a common norm in Pakistan, where brides are often inhumanly treated on the grounds of bringing less dowry, neglecting commands of in-laws, or even demanding their fundamental rights. Consequently, under such social obligations, all such social obligations exacerbate women's vulnerability to experience emotional, physical, and sexual abuse within their own homes, a place that is supposedly anticipated safe. It is often reported that parents of the victims, despite being aware of their daughter's troubled marriage relationships, discourage any contemplations about leaving their partners. Within Pakistani context, victims of domestic violence are also aware of the likely gender barriers and humiliation they might experience while consulting legal support services to report a domestic violence incident, where nearly all formal and informal spaces, may be family, legal institutions, medical practitioners, and even religious clergy, are dominated by men. The service providers, rather than taking instant action, often tend to restore cultural biases by persuading victims to reconcile with the perpetrators. Similarly, when it comes to gender-based violence, Australia is no exception. According to our Watch report, during 2021 to 2022, 5,606 women were hospitalized due to family and domestic violence. 1 in 4 women has experienced some form of abuse by her cohabiting partner since the age of 50. Scholarly literature on culturally and linguistically diverse women in Australia reveals that immigrant women remain highly vulnerable to domestic violence. Factors like irregular visa status, inaccurate or limited understanding of the unfamiliar legal system, immigration policies, repercussions of legal interventions in the form of losing child custody or deportation to home country can encumber women's ability to navigate formal reporting mechanisms against their perpetrators. People who migrate to another country cannot be considered as borderless people. Instead, their lives remain somewhat intertwined between current and former country of residence. Immigrant women who stay connected with their home culture may continue to stay entangled within the confines of empowerment as well as oppression even after migration. Consequently, cultural constraints may continue to apply to women to consider violence as a family matter to avoid shame and stigmatization, which obfuscates their capacity to extricate violence. For instance, Kaluchi and colleagues, while studying domestic violence among Indian immigrant women in Australia, revealed women participants deemed that employing formal coping mechanisms against perpetrators could only bring impotence and isolation. Later in 2016, another study on Indian immigrant women reported that victims witnessed no significant changes in gender hierarchy and violence practices within their domestic spheres, even after migrating to an empowered environment like Australia. Likewise, Kafunia, while studying the domestic violence experiences of Muslim immigrant women in Australia, revealed that lack of knowledge about migration laws, insecure visa, and cultural beliefs about idealistic womanhood prevents women from reporting domestic violence incidents. Similar evidence was reported by Afroz and colleagues while studying domestic violence among newly migrated Afghan women in Australia. Here, I argue that within migration context, the process of violence coping mechanisms may experience a paradigm shift, which can be often contingent on the social environments which predispose victims to adopt consistent forms of behavior. The cross-border transition in social institutions may enhance scope of women's freedom to practice their choices, especially in case of women, all those cultural elements that might have been obstructing them from achieving their goals may get contested in the host country that offers them an enhanced access to social and legal resources. The expanded range of options can empower female victims of domestic violence to resist patriarchy-facilitated abuse, while after migration, a risk they may have dreaded in their country of origin. So, my study here argues that while dissecting domestic violence, it is important to understand how patriarchy can be perpetuated by different members of the family, especially by elder women, who may suppress younger daughters-in-law to preserve their control over family relationships and resources. Therefore, to understand these dynamics, my study draws from the analytical lens of bargaining with the patriarchy given by Denise Gilgiotti and Sherry B. Ortner's concept of agency. The former concept focuses on strategies women practice within a framework of structural limitations to navigate patriarchy and manage gendered relationships, while the later argues that social actors, despite being products of cultural and structural reproduction, can possess the capacity to counteract the systems that shape them. Using these concepts, my study aims to reveal in how many ways household power hierarchies disadvantage younger married women and how transnational migration shifts the power dynamics in shaping women's identity, dependency, and power negotiating mechanisms. It will also help in examining how migration and mobility and the ensuing shift in the living arrangements shape or reshape household power dynamics and individuals' social agency. Through this lens, I will determine whether practicing violence against spouses occurs as a self-perpetuated act or indirectly induced by kinship. In this way, my study aims to revisit UN's general definition of domestic and intimate partner abuse that defines it as a pattern of behaviors in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. It appears this definition cannot be comprehended unanimously as it tends to overlook diverse and complex kinship systems. It is crucial to examine the underlying factors fostering patriarchal behavior among men who may emerge as the primary perpetrators in cases of domestic violence. Furthermore, to understand patriarchal bargaining and agentic interventions of victims, it is important to consider their distinct attributes. The framework of patriarchal bargaining gives a slight sense that usually women are disadvantaged by patriarchy. However, some women may not always play the role of passive victims in the face of patriarchy. For example, their interpretation of patriarchy and power negotiating mechanism may differ with reference to their class, ethnicity, and visa statuses. Similarly, the concept of agency apparently seems individual-focused, whereas it is important to consider how social and structural factors may impact agency of an individual. It is essential to consider the internal struggles endured by women survivors of domestic violence while exercising their agency within constraining circumstances. For example, the ability to exert agency can be fortified or weakened by the resources and opportunities available to them. Moreover, the agency can be shaped by contextual circumstances and has the potential to evolve, as some victims can consciously opt for actions like silence or adopt submissive behaviors to achieve their inherent goals and manipulate circumstances. During the review of literature, it was further observed that a significant body of literature has highlighted violence experiences of women victims and efforts they put to negotiate power differentials. However, utilization of these concepts to understand processes of victimization and empowerment by comparing home and host country milieux seems underdeveloped. My research here seeks to bridge this gap by generating a comparative analysis incorporating pre- and post-migration experiences of married women. In this way, I will further delve deeper into the intricate connections between participants' home country visits and the perpetuation of traditional patriarchy, which may yield resurgence of conventional patriarchal attitudes amongst men. In this way, I will look how such visits interrupt women's ability to exert agency after reintegrating into extended family system and the cultural milieu that fosters patriarchy. So broadly, my research questions focus on exploring what socio-cultural factors enable or prevent immigrant Pakistani women's decision to file formal reports on domestic violence. What informal mechanisms do Pakistani immigrant women adopt to cope with domestic violence? And how do migration and mobility shape Pakistani immigrant women's attitudes and practices in relation to domestic violence? This research follows a qualitative design, and the fieldwork was completed in Melbourne region after obtaining ethical approval in the month of July 2023 to approach women community with the rationale to investigate a sensitive topic. Developing social connections was deemed of utmost importance. Therefore, I decided to move to an area where I could locate substantial number of Pakistanis, and eventually I leased a house in Faulkner suburb of Melbourne, which really helped me in integrating with the Pakistani women community. I established my connections by visiting leisure clubs, sports clubs, public schools, which later helped in recruitment process and building trust with the women participants. To recruit the participants, I also used platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp groups, women's referrals, which helped in swelling the snowball. The data was collected through unstructured interviews, focus group discussions, and online participant observation. The participants of the research involved married men and women who had arrived in Australia on different visa categories. The sampling criterion was derived from the scholarly work stressing that vulnerability of immigrant women to violence is amplified by factors such as exploitation of their migration status by perpetrators. I used this criterion to understand any correlation that may exist between visa status and power negotiation mechanisms of women victims of domestic violence. The identity of the participants was identified with these pseudonyms, and the women were given the authority to select a pseudonym for themselves, and most of them chose the name of their mothers and all. And my interview schedule was divided into three main sections. Section 1 focused on participants' pre- and post-marriage lifestyles, pre- and post-migration experiences. Section 2 focused on their perceptions of domestic violence within home and host country context. And Section 3 involved questions encompassing their personal exposure to domestic violence, if applicable. The focus group discussion Materials were also designed in 3 different formats. The first part of the discussion involved a grid exercise in which participants were given a list of perpetrations and were requested to evaluate their intensity and later comment on prevalence of domestic violence as an issue within Pakistani context. In the second part, participants were given a scenario depicting a story of a couple living in an extended family system and were requested to share the perceptions on the given set of questions. The third section involved 2 visual clips showing the story of a female immigrant woman who was exposed to domestic violence, after which participants were given an opportunity to comment on the prevalence of the issue within migration context and the challenges victims may face to cope with violence exposure within a host country. The focus group discussions were conducted with 4 separate groups, in which Group 1 involved men who sponsored their spouses, Group 2 involved men who arrived as dependents of their spouses, Group 3 comprised women who were housewives, and Group 4 involved women who were professionally active. During online participation, I observed public posts of women victims to understand types of perpetrations they are exposed to and the kinds of suggestions women community members provide to cope with the given situation. Lastly, just to give a quick glimpse of the findings, it was revealed that emotional and financial abuse, despite being most common forms of perpetrations, remained highly underreported. Almost amongst all cases, direct and indirect involvement of in-laws was deemed crucial. To negotiate power differentials, women had been strategizing various techniques involving bargaining, covert agential tactics like silence, obedience, subservience to achieve individual projects. Factors like dependent visa status, inadequate information about migration laws in relation to family violence, and likely repercussions of deportation in some cases played a crucial part in restricting women's ability to resist violence or leave an abusive partner. Whereas in some cases, principal visa applicant status of women resulted in changing men's patriarchal attitudes towards their wives as their residential status depended on them. Similarly, in some cases, women who had been previously practicing subservience resorted to overt forms of agency during their post-migration phases, which involved actions like showing verbal resistance, threats of calling police, and even taking independent decisions of exiting their abusive relationships, which could have been a difficult endeavor within their home country context. However, it was crucial to note that social networks of within Australia played an important part in encouraging women to use legal help against violence. Lastly, the patriarchal attitudes of men that were suppressed within host country reverted to their original forms during their home country visits. So that was a collective collection of the findings which I have so far, which seemed interesting. I could share with the attendees here. So that would be all, and any question that you may wish to ask. That was a race against time.
Very timely. This is
That's really very interesting. My question is, have you thought about how you would write the stories of your participants, given that you're working with a very close-knit specific diaspora where stories of their intimate relationship could be easily identifiable even when you have anonymized sources?
For this particular reason, I give them the opportunity to de-identify themselves, because only themselves they can find out, okay, this part of the story, when I am going to share the summary of the findings, only the participant is going to identify, okay, here she's talking about me. So there were chances like if I choose pseudonyms for them myself, it was likely that I might come up with a name that any of the relative could identify. It could be a chance. So in this way, I give that authority to the respondents themselves to ensure inclusivity, so that they know, they are assured that their identity will not be identified with any other relative who accidentally comes and reads out the research paper or the findings summary. So that was a strategy that I used, so that we had a close discussion with the participants as well, that okay, are they feeling safe to proceed with the name. And they were like, okay, we have the thumbs up, go ahead. So yeah, and the thing I shared during my presentation is that some chose the name of their mothers-in-law just to take out the grudge they were feeling for them, and just to take out the pain they were facing because of their interference and because of the control they were exercising when they were staying in Pakistan, and even after migrating to Australia, they were getting connected through telephonic chats, private telephonic chats. And they said, my husband goes to toilet for 30 to 40 minutes and he's constantly talking to his mother. So that I cannot understand. I cannot hold my ear against the door all the time, but I know that he is going to the toilet, he is going to take 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, he is grumpy at everything. And they said that, okay, this continues to happen. But the intensity was slightly less because the absence of extended family members was perceived as an empowering factor. Like it was helping them to stand against whatever was being imposed. Because if the same could have happened in Pakistan, they were the only one who was trying to oppose, and the whole group was there in the support of the perpetrator, or directly or indirectly participating in the perpetration. So yeah, that was interesting to note. Like yeah, there was a slightly restriction in the involvement, but it was still continuing because in Australia, Pakistani immigrant women or the Pakistanis represent a recent diaspora. Like they started arriving in 80s or so. But unlike Britain, where they had been living for generations, so situations there are quite different as compared to Australia, because the family members, they also have to face challenges to get the visa, because nowadays I usually read the Facebook posts and everyone is complaining, they rejected my dad's visa, they say that he will not go back and all that. So that's a blessing in disguise for those women who can just enjoy a lifestyle of their own in a separate dwelling, which was not the case before migration.
Thank you, Sana. Well, it's break time, but so thank you again. So I'm very happy to be introducing Ivy Sedzro, whose talk is called Weighing the Risk Perception of Ghanaian Female Migrants to the Gulf States. So moving away from Australia now, and moving away from family violence, perhaps, and tell you a little bit about Ivy. She became interested in international development after growing up in different regions of Ghana and observing how development solutions can practically improve the lives of people affected by poverty. Having worked and studied on 4 different continents, Ivy has developed a deep appreciation for diverse cultures and nuanced global perspectives. Her research endeavours to examine the risk perceptions of Ghanaian female labour migrants to the Gulf countries. And I'm very much looking forward to this.
So thank you all for staying for the second section of this presentation. I must say the first 3 has been quite intensive, so I promise to keep this quite simple and light. So yeah, my study focuses on the risk subjectivities of women migrating from Ghana to the Gulf states. And here I'm just looking at how they tend to conceptualize the risks of migration. So before I proceed, I want to give a brief background of the countries involved in this migration process. So for a few of you would know, Ghana is located in the western part of Africa and currently has a population of about 32 million, and half of these are women. The GDP of our country is relatively low to the countries that used to migrate to, which is the 6 Gulf countries of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman. So as you can see, they have very high GDPs, but very low population, which makes them very hot migration places for where women want to migrate to, and sort of create a sort of lucrative industries for labor migrants. However, the migration to these places is not without risk, and women that tend to migrate there tend to experience several types of risk or several forms of risk. And so in 2019, for instance, the IOM report of Ghanaian migration indicated that out of the 5,000 migrants we found in the Gulf states, we have about 82% of these being women. And this number has increased after the COVID. The risk that these women tend to experience starts from the time which they conceptualize the idea of wanting to migrate. And so their interaction with the connection men or the agent, for instance, sort of exposes them to some sort of risk, such as them being defrauded or being given false information about the migration process, or in worst cases, being trafficked or smuggled if they choose to. Now, when they get to these places where, I mean, eventually the Gulf countries, the migration system there, which is supposed to protect the labor migrant, sort of creates a certain power dynamic that sort of makes these women less advantageous to whatever benefits a migrant should be able to gain, i.e. the employees, or what they popularly call the madams, can sort of confiscate their passports to prevent them from leaving the migrant houses or their contract houses. Now, when they also get to the contract houses where they're supposed to work mostly as domestic workers or nannies, they are sexually abused by the husbands of their employees or their madams. They are verbally abused, which is very, very common. They're made to work for very, very long hours. They then face mental and emotional exhaustion at the end of the day. Eventually, okay, so here you see certain pictures of them crying that they are not slaves. Eventually they get deported and they are left with nothing. Get back to the country, and then they're stigmatized for being failed migrants. Now, amidst all these processes, or all these risks that is involved, information campaigns have been raised or have been sort of put up by several NGOs in the country and the IOM in the country about the risks involved with the migration process. But however, the aftermath of these policies that have been sort of institutionalized has sort of led to, should I say, bad effects. Now, women have sought to find irregular ways of migrating. So rather than going through the regular routes of going to the airport and then migrating or leaving the country, they now seek to use the neighboring countries of Togo or Burkina Faso to migrate. And in these instances, they tend to be more trafficked, or they are eventually smuggled into places like Libya. So what then becomes the conceptualization of risk for these men? Because they know about this risk, they know what is involved, yet they keep going. And that's where my research comes in. So in order to do this, I got the opportunity to interview about 45 groups of 45 women, 15 for each group of migrants. So potential migrants, current migrants, and returnees. And in order to do this, I also decided to adopt the cultural theory of risk perception, which was propounded or theorized by Mary Douglas. And the theory states that our cultural environment or our society sort of constructs how we tend to look at risk, for instance. And so these can possibly influence how we tend to conceptualize or perceive risk. I also added the biographical narratives of these women to show how nuanced they tend to conceptualize the risk involved in the migration process. So when I spoke to the women for a period of about 4 months and did an ethnographic observation, I realized that there were 4 main gender dynamics within the household. So I realized that the women possessed a certain or carried a certain sort of gender identity, which sort of influenced the way they tended to look at risk. The performativity of their gender roles also played a role in how they tended to look at risk, the gender inequality they tended to face, and then the shifting gender roles or evolving gender roles within the household in which they stay. So what becomes the gender identity for these women? So gender identity, well, all of them are identified as women. I should make that clear. And for a woman to be called a woman in Ghana or defined as a good woman in Ghana, there were certain traits that were needed. They were needed to sort of have or carry, which include the ability to be gentle, to be humble, to be nurturing, to be hardworking. They had to be tactful in the way they sort of communicated their opinions or how assertive they were to the male heads in their family, or how they tended to submit to authority. So when you look at a quote such as the one by Agatha, so Agatha, when she was about to migrate, had to seek permission from her husband. And in doing this, it made her look like a good woman in terms of the Ghanaian definition of what a good woman should be. Now, to interest you to know that the dynamic of a woman submitting to a certain kind of authority has been conducted in other studies in Ghana, and show that these men consider this process as a way of empowerment or as a form of agency for them. So they do not feel disempowered when they submit to authority of their husbands or their fathers or their elder brothers within their community. Now, in doing so, when women tend to migrate or when they tend to conceptualize the risks of migration, they tend to think that, okay, I am migrating to support my family. And that is how they tend to perceive the risks of migrating to these countries. And so for a woman that is unwilling to migrate, for instance, or to take the risk to move to these places, it shows that you're not fit to be a proper woman, or what their communities would define as a proper Ghanaian woman. Now, moving on to the next conceptualization or the next dynamic that's involved in how women tend to conceptualize race, which is the performativity of their gender roles. Now, this is quite similar to their gender identity. It's the ability to reenact practices that get to show that they are indeed good women in their communities. And so this may involve how they may organize the household or take care of the children or take care of the elderly within their communities. So in a sense, it's more like they have to keep doing this gender. And their ability to do this over the years makes them feel that they have a certain leverage, a certain skill set that makes them position themselves to be able to surmount the risk of migrating to the Gulf countries. So when you talk to a lady, or when I got a chance to speak to a lady like Ama Sewa, her training with her stepmom over the years made her feel that I have been able to ascertain all the skills involved to be able to work for long hours whilst I was in Ghana. So why can't I go to the Gulf countries and then do long hours? So to her, risk becomes surmountable or overcomable. Now, when you also look at another dimension, and this was from an interview from an elder migrant. She feels that a properly trained Ghanaian woman should be able to overcome such risks, such as long hours, right? So to her, I mean, there's no way you should be talking about be work for long hours, because that's what a Ghanaian woman embodies, or that's what a Ghanaian woman should do. So to her, the risk is non-existent, for example. Now, I'm moving on to the next dimension, which is the way they tend to conceptualize race in terms of the gender inequalities that they face in their household. So gender inequality for these women essentially delves on how they feel disadvantaged based on the gender relations in the household. And so in terms of making decisions or economic resources, and how they feel that they've done certain work within their communities and they are supposed to have certain kind of resources attached to their name, and they feel deprived of that. So therefore, migrating to the Gulf states becomes a way they can empower themselves or change that gender inequality within their household or within their communities. When we move on to the second and final dynamic of the gender dynamics within this communities for which women stayed, this is also quite similar to what's it called? Quite similar to the performativity of the gender roles. So with this, women live in households that already have the gender dynamic change. So they are now the breadwinners of the house, and the men in the households are now taking care of the children. And so what happens is that they now want to take on the risk of migrating to the Gulf states in order to reinforce the newly ascertained power that they now have. But the irony is that for women that tend to migrate or tend to sort of push for this change in gender dynamics, they tend to be considered or stigmatized as risky, and other women are told to avoid them. So the woman, for instance, will not have to weigh the risk of, do I go and sort of empower myself, or do I stay and then, or do I not go and then be turned as a good woman? So they are now baffled with sort of weighing different risks in order to make these migratory decisions. So I'm almost done. So yeah, it's that simple.
Is it?
So the question then becomes, why should we consider the gender dynamics of risks, for instance, when we are talking about migration? And I feel that when we do this, we're able to sort of identify the risk subjectivities that are involved in the migration process, for instance. We are also able to draw attention to the intricacies that are involved when people tend to conceptualize the risks and make migratory decisions. Yep, thank you.
Salta is a research specialist with more than 10 years experience in think tanks and public agencies, and she's currently working on a research project focused on the experiences of refugee women doing business in Australia. Through this project, Saltanat considers issues of subordination and discrimination of refugee women entrepreneurs, with a specific focus on the intersectionality of gender, refugee status, and entrepreneurship.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it's always hard to be the first one and to be the last one to present, I guess, so I'm a lucky one as well. Just like Sam, I also changed slightly the title of my presentation. So, and it better captures the general idea of the project that I'm working on. So yeah, I'm second year PhD student from the University of Melbourne, School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. The project that I'm working on aims to challenge the existing gendered, ethnocentrically biased assumptions about entrepreneurship by delving deep into the experiences of refugee women entrepreneurs who's running business here in Australia. Unfortunately for refugee women entrepreneurs and women in business in general, negative thinking and stereotyping is deeply rooted in academia. Academic literature addresses refugee women entrepreneurs as others, minority, disadvantaged, or invisible entrepreneurs. They have a lot of names, actually. So they place them in so-called entrepreneurial ghettos, I would say. And being labeled as others, refugee women entrepreneurs are reproduced as secondary or something else. So they're not equal. They are considered to be a deviation from the norm. And being envisioned as something else, refugee women entrepreneurs are often neglected in entrepreneurial studies, and as such, their voices are silenced. Because as it was said in one of the interviews, nobody bothers to listen. However, in this project, I want to amplify their voices by engaging in deep conversations about their experiences, about their journeys here in Australia. In doing so, I conducted semi-structured interviews with refugee women entrepreneurs who open and is running a business in Australia, specifically
Melbourne and Sydney. I centered my interview questions around 4 key themes: motivation, barriers, challenges, impact and success, place and context. The final topic, which explores the location and Australia more broadly, places an extra focus on contextual circumstances. Up until now, most of the entrepreneurial research has been predominantly place-blind or placeless, which appears to be surprising, especially when we talk about displacement and people moving from one place to another. Thus, in this project, I put an extra effort, an extra focus on place and location more broadly. But enough about the context. I would like to proceed to the first theme. I would like to proceed to motivation and driving factors that bring refugee women into business. It is argued that refugees are more entrepreneurial compared to mainstream and even migrant entrepreneurs. Thus, unsurprisingly, entrepreneurial intention is at the core of refugee studies. Being a part of a larger group of so-called other entrepreneurs, refugee women entrepreneurs are claimed to be necessity-driven, and as such, they fall under less productive cohort of entrepreneurs, which in its way also possess negative thinking about them. However, refugee women entrepreneurs are a very diverse group of entrepreneurs who cannot simply be explained by opportunity versus necessity model of classification. Refugee women's motivation could be other than economic, and as such cannot be limited to binary classification of necessity and opportunity driven. Some of the women that I've interviewed wanted to make difference. Some of them wanted to share their culture and heritage, while others wanted to bring their children to Australia. And some saw no other options because of the limited opportunities in the labor market. So initial findings of my project aligns with the recent critiques of this binary classification of entrepreneurs. Refugee women entrepreneurs start their business for myriad of reasons: economic, psychological, social ones, and moreover, their motivation can shift and change over the time. But regardless of the reasons and circumstances that brought these women to entrepreneurship, all of them have one thing in common, and it's that they have to run an extra mile to start their business. They have to work harder as they commonly face greater barriers. And as you can see from this slide, for some of them, it's even a traumatic experience. And the research that is there so far suggests that refugee entrepreneurs encounter greater barriers compared to economic migrants. Because living with no preparation, refugees often arrive to the host countries with no valuable credentials. Most commonly, they face challenges. They struggle with access to finance, poor language skills, complex laws and regulations, and limited access to business support. But is that it, or are we missing something? And that was the question that I've asked myself before I started these interviews. And that when I started to look at intersectionality as an approach to look closer at the challenges and barriers this women face. So intersectionality lens shed light on often unnoticed challenges faced by refugee women entrepreneurs. As you can see from this slide, some of the barriers, challenges are very nuanced and subtle. Every woman I've interviewed has her own story, which is shaped by her experience, past and present. And the intersectionality approach perspective helped to unveil some of the hidden barriers refugee women face. For some of them, it was their caring responsibilities that hindered their prospects for growth. Mobility was an issue for others, and while some faced health-related issues linked to their age. And when it comes to refugees in general, or refugee entrepreneurs in general. We have to take a closer look at the interplay of opportunities and constraints refugee women entrepreneurs are embedded into to better understand their experiences. We also have to challenge our understanding of success. Refugee women entrepreneurs being an exact opposite of a male archetype of entrepreneur are a deviation from the norm. And as such, their experiences are not valid. Their achievements are often neglected, as the economists are prone to treat as non-existent what is not quantifiable and sometimes even what is not measurable. The neoliberal framing puts certain limitations on what can be considered as entrepreneurial success. And on top of that, the very measures that I use to assess performance are gendered and they sustain masculine norms. And yet, as we can see from this slide, refugee women entrepreneurs define success on their own terms, prioritizing self-care and care over the growth, size, and profit. While their success stories, well, their interpretation of success is more socially focused, this doesn't mean they are less important, that their interpretation is less important or not valid. Perhaps it's that we should rethink what we know about entrepreneurial success and shift our gaze from stories of Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, to stories of refugee women entrepreneurs, and acknowledge the fact that success is complex and multi-layered concept. And talking about the individuals like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, we tend to think of them as an epitome of entrepreneurial success. We want every single entrepreneur to be as good as those two. However, individuals like them are hard to find in any cohort of entrepreneurs, not to mention refugee entrepreneurs. But is that the individuals to be blamed? Is it something wrong or dysfunctional about refugee entrepreneurs? The short answer is no, because the problem is that the majority of entrepreneurial studies trying to find the secret recipe of success tend to focus on individuals and on their personal traits rather than the context. They overlook the context specificity of entrepreneurship. They are generally place blind, looking merely at behavioral characteristics or motivations for the startups. And at the same time, considering refugee entrepreneurs in isolation from the context offers a very limited understanding of their experiences. Contextual effects, things that are not explained by age, gender, ethnicity, or class, are mostly missing in entrepreneurial research. And in case of refugee women entrepreneurs, we don't pay enough attention to the change of the context and location. That's why in this project, I bring place and context into the forefront of the study, talking with the refugee women about the place of their business, the neighborhood, the Australian context in general. And as you can see from some of the interviews I had with these women, location matters for them. It shapes their experiences. For some of them, the change of context, the country in general, eliminated the limitations of age. Others noticed the change of their personality, while some encountered new opportunities offered by the cultural diversity of their new home. And to sum up, I would say that place is indeed is a way of knowing, and it's a way of learning from it personally, learning about the experiences of refugee entrepreneurs. Thank you. That's it for me.
So interesting, and you've got loads of time, so you can have lots of questions.
I've tried my best.
Yeah. Any questions for Saltanat? Oh, Gemma.
You spoke of opening business and being an entrepreneur as a potential source of trauma for some of the women. I was wondering if any of the women spoke about being entrepreneurs as something that was empowering or even provided a sense of healing from traumatic experiences.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, every story of every refugee woman is unique, and for every one of them, their experiences are different. For some of them, it was a new way. It was actually aligned with starting a new life, making their Some of them have been dreaming about having their own business, and they started the business, and now they feel like they can do everything, anything is possible for them. So yeah, it has a lot of, and I talk about impact. I just haven't talk about it in this presentation, but we talk with this woman, we talk about the impact of the business on themselves, on their families, on their communities in general. So yeah, it's
Thanks a lot for sharing your research. Very interesting. One of the things I was thinking is, and which makes your research so interesting, is that you can actually, through your research, challenge our understanding of who are the entrepreneurs and what is entrepreneurship. Like the examples you gave with refugee women working with food, with cooking, that they are actually entrepreneurs. So yeah, that's like a very important contribution. Can you tell more about what type of work or startups they like refugee women
businesses they run? So I did. So the women that we interviewed, some of them run catering business or they have their own cafe. Some of them are in fashion business. Some of them are in creative arts. Some of them in caring industry. So it's, yeah, maybe in a way it's expected, though those are the industries refugee women tend to be in mostly.
Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking about your deadlines, that idea that success looks different for them, and your awareness in your presentation that we are sold an idea of success. There's an idea of what is a successful entrepreneur, and these women are resignifying what success is for them. And I was wondering if they were aware of it. If they were aware that there was a tension between how they were looking at success and how what was what they wanted from their business and what the world wants from their business.
There's a perception that they're not doing enough, some of them, or they know that they're doing a lot, but they know that circumstances are different for them and they have to prove themselves to be successful and to align to those structured or overly structured perceptions of success. But whenever we talk about them, we get to the point where they sometimes say, success for me personally is different. I know that it is like this, but for me personally, it is like this. And I feel like I'm successful. It depends.
Building on that question, I wanted to ask you, I don't know if it came up during the definitions of success changed significantly before and after coming here to Australia.
That's a good question. And no, we don't talk about the way their perceptions of success changed over the time. Even though we talk about their experiences of running business back home and here in Australia, because some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they had previous experiences of owning a business in one or several countries and then starting all over again here in Australia. But no, we don't talk about the way it changed. That's a good question.
Okay. Oh, follow up.
So my fantastic project. It's really, really interesting. Good job with the presentation. One of the things I'm interested in is why so many refugee background people move into entrepreneurship. And I do research on racism, and I think it's probably racism has an impact on that. And so people start their businesses because they can't get a job. Is that something you found in your research?
Yeah, as I said, some of the women, they started business because of necessity. And the general perception is that refugee women will start business because of necessity, because they can't find another option on the labor market, and they have to become self-employed or have to run their own business. And this is the case for some of them. And some of them, they even run part-time. They work part-time and then run a business, but they work part-time to sustain their business. And for these women, business is their dream or something that they really want to do, and they work to sustain it. So it's different. It's really different, and that's question. It goes back to motivation. Why they start business and why refugees are so entrepreneurial. And is it the case?
Thank you, Sasha. That's a great question. So I'd like to invite Kylie and Victor up to, I don't know how you want to run this, so I'll let you do that.
We don't know how we want to run.
She's on style.
Okay, awesome. So I'm just gonna go first so that Kylie, who's the most senior person, gets to run first. Most senior academic. That's true.
I want to go with hierarchies.
Yeah, why not? For university, so why not? So I want to start, well, first of all, saying thank you to all of you, right, for taking the time to wrap up all of your research into 15 minutes and package it so nicely for us to understand better what you're doing. I've been at the University of Melbourne for 15 years, and I think we've come a long way in just 15 years, you know, from very generic research about concepts into the space where we're able to have a symposium with this very, you know, like intricate issues and doing it in an intersectional, meaningful way. So really appreciate that. I want to start with the research by Saltanat. Where are you? So it's interesting because I've done a fair bit of reading about entrepreneurship and gender, right? And there are so many elements of your research that resonate with everything that I've read, right? So basically, you have a situation where you have a bunch of white boys doing research about white boys, and then the research ends up being without a place, for instance, because the place is typically finance and tech, and it's assumed that that's the place. So you don't even have to really mention it or talk about it because everybody assumes that when you're talking about entrepreneurship in those cohorts, that's what you're talking about, right? And that's the end of it. So I'm glad that you're sort of like doing a literature review where you're able to highlight those elements and the ghettoization of a specific people, because that's what women have experienced in entrepreneurship, right? The fact that it's like there is entrepreneurship and then there is female entrepreneurship, right? The same thing that has happened with leadership. There is leadership and then there is gender and leadership. So again, not surprised with any of that, but I did appreciate those insights about motivation, right? And what it takes, like the level of motivation that takes to be an entrepreneur. How much higher it has to be, right? Being a refugee. So the fact that you need to imagine a different world and a different life for yourself to be a refugee, because you really need to, you know, extricate yourself from your day-to-day life to go somewhere else. So not surprising that these people find the energy to also pursue other things that most people in society don't. Most people don't start a new business, okay? And so I would see a relationship between those two elements there. And then it makes sense that in your research you do find place, because these are also people who are moving, right? With quite intentionally too, to go to a place where you could have a better life. Well, you could have a life, first of all, you know, because they are fleeing very difficult situations. So I feel like there is a lot here that you will be able to contribute to this literature by highlighting particularly the elements of the ghettoization of the literature on women's refugees. So thanks for that. So thinking about the first three presentations by Anna, Samantha, and Sana, great complement to each other, right? Because you start with this idea of policies being used as tools for oppression. That's literally how they are being used, right? So literally you are creating an entire system that is supposed to be here to protect people, to safeguard humans, to provide better conditions for them. But in fact, it is designed with a very negative hypothesis about the person, okay? And that means that we need to safeguard our country from these individuals, okay? So it's very hard to design good policy and kind and humane policy when you actually, well, there's racism underpinning the way that you're thinking about how you should approach this thing. And then there is a discursive element here that reinforces the structure that you created. So this idea that we are developing these policies to protect the Australian values of, you know, how much we care about preventing violence and protecting women, when in fact our statistics of family violence are brutal. without introducing any kind of ethnic or racial lens to it, right? So I really did appreciate that contrast between what what you create, the system that you're creating, and then the rhetorical tools that you're using. Both of them ultimately serving to oppress these women, and their partners, their ex-partners, and putting them in a precarious situation to the point that they are. I love how that connects to the conversation about risk, right? Because they are calculating the risk attached to speaking up or not speaking up all the time, right? And then in that calculation, many of them decide not to speak up because that's easier than dealing with the system that we created to help them. So I really did appreciate a lot of that. I love the idea of the network of agents that are at play to preserve domestic violence. So that's sort of what I understood from this presentation, right? That it's not just a relationship between two people, but you have, this is what we know from Australian research, right? In some communities, you have the pastor, of the church, or the father, right? You have the parents of both people who are in the domestic violence situation, also telling people that you need to come back, you need to go back to the situation, okay? Because the patriarchal structure has to be preserved at all costs, okay? And so I did like this idea of looking at the system of oppression that is being created here. And in terms of how to theorize this, I think that's sort of what I would like to see more, right? So to see a multi-level analysis of them, or how you have the policy environment, how you have the kind of values, how you have the rhetorical tools that people are using, how you have the more inner network of people who are helping reinforce all of this and keeping people at risk. And then, coming back to your research on risk, I love the fact, because I was thinking about it quite differently when I started listening to you. I love this very introspective way of understanding risk. So these people, these women, are negotiating risk with themselves more than the structural risk they might be facing when they are moving to a different location. And I thought that was fascinating because as an organizational psychologist, I'm always thinking about like risk policy and risk prevention in that sense. So looking at these women talking about the negotiation, not losing yourself in a way, right? So you have a specific set of values of worldviews, and are moving to a different place to be able to support your family. You need to negotiate with yourself who is it that you are now as a woman, okay? And how you need to do that here in your head, but also in the way that you're going to be performing all of this. And I love the fact that you define that different people were actually using it also as a way to empower themselves, to see themselves as an agent of change in a changing world. Anyway, so those are sort of my thoughts on this. I think it will be interesting to see how you're going to end up theorizing these specific notions of risk, right? Which are very much about, I don't know, in a way, not losing yourself in this process of change that you're going through more than the actual risk of the abuse that you might experience in a specific location. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on this. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you, all of you, and I'm going to sort of do a more as a group conversation or some thoughts. I've taken a stack of notes and I want to spend days talking with each of you. But there were some things that sort of really sparked or shined for me as you were talking, and one of them was thinking about, with my ethics hat, because I can never not do that, was to think about how for each of you it's quite different and unique research, but some of the fundamental layers are ethics. And if you think about a key principle of ethics is respect. And what you've each done is developed research designs and methods of data collection that give voice to women. And that is really important and unique. And you could have said, it's too hard to do because I can't get it through ethics. It's going to be a struggle. It's going to take me more time. There's a whole variety of excuses. You could have said, I'll just speak to lawyers, or I'll just speak to the people who issue, whatever. There's a whole variety of ways that you could have sidestepped that. But what you've done is you've taken risks to say, actually, I'm going to privilege the voice of women, and this is going to be participatory. So thank you for that. And I think that that's something that you need to really think about as you're writing, whether it's your thesis or an article, the political and strategic choices that you made about your research design. And that while it's not without problems, it is absolutely 150% worth doing. So thank you. The other thing that I thought about was, for each of you, what kept hitting me in the face was issues of power and power relationships. And the way that you have framed or starting to think about your research, where you're starting to try and wrangle ideas of how power continues to shift and change, that it's not fixed, and that it's not necessarily just about power on people, but the way that there are glimmers of the way that women become powerful. So the risk of saying, actually, no, I'm leaving this person, takes risk. You know, you have to be brave, you have to be strong, even though you might not feel it. So really representing that. The risk of saying, actually, I'm going to move because this means I can, you know, feed my families. There's a whole variety of risks, but what you've done is really start to think about power, and rather than positioning women as victims who are vulnerable, in need of protection. I'm not saying that that's not part of the discourses, but you're also starting to show the glimmers of how these women are trying to take control of their lives and their families and what that means. And so you're portraying strong women rather than just vulnerable women. And so the complexity of how do you show that in multiple ways? I'm waiting for the bat to come up, so I'm just being mindful about that. And the other thing I want to maybe just leave on is, I also want to say, maybe as a more general comment, that this research is also a risk to women researchers. And often we're, as we're engaging with these projects, we think about what's our risks, you know, identify the risks, what's the risk management to protect participants, but we forget about the risks to the researcher. So as women, you know, what are the risks, what are the triggers as our participants tell their stories that actually trigger issues around gender-based violence, around sexism? What are the issues for some of our researchers around the risks of triggers for racism as well? And so part of, as researchers, we need to also think about care of the self and how we think about how we reflect, how we connect with people to be able to debrief, because this work takes emotional labour, and it is wearing, and sometimes you need to take a break from it. So again, I just want to acknowledge that for the 5 of you, but also for many of you in the audience, that don't forget those risks as well. But thank you, amazing, and thank you, Karen, and everybody for putting this on. But I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
I'm going to give you this job more often. That was fantastic. Thank you. And I hope that that was valuable for you all to hear about, and some really different reflections on all of that. Well, I thought today was wonderful. Every one of you are doing great projects, and they're all really fascinating. As was drawn out by at the end, you know, lots and lots of overlapping themes. I think we could all talk to all of you for many days, so I hope you put some aside to answer all the questions. But we'll leave it there. I want to say thanks to Claire especially for all the organising. Thanks to Victor and Kylie, and thank you all for coming.